name is Harold Davis. I'm here to teach you about the art and craft of digital photography. Hi, everyone. I hope you're all doing well today. So I decided to put up an interesting background, virtual background here, just to give an idea of some of the kinds of things you can create out of using LAB adjustments. If you look at the back of this Photoshop composite that's behind me, you'll see that there are a lot of interesting colors in it. And if you see imagery with the kind of cyan blue and kind of yellow here, that's a bit of a giveaway that this was probably partially at least created using LAB. What I really ought to do is duck out of the way so you can see the rest of the thing. The inspiration for me in creating this piece, besides a long night and perhaps some Pink Floyd on my headset, was Piranesi's architectural drawing. So I wanted to create this fantastic staircase going up forever in sort of a piece of bombastic architecture. With that said, I wouldn't mind applying LAB inversions to my shirt either. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And here you go. This is the second of 2 LAB color webinars. We're going to recap a bit of what we did last week. I'm going to show an example of how to use LAB to enhance portraiture. And I want to make it clear when I say show an example, if I were pressed, and maybe even if I was not pressed, I could do an entire webinar on how to use LAB with portraits. I could also do an entire LAB webinar or workshop in how to use it with landscapes. So we're not going to do that here. We're just going to show a few examples and leave it to you to figure out how you might use this in your own work. We're going to take a look at inversions and adjustments. I'm going to also run my action, well, probably a bunch of times. And we're going to process some inversions. I'm going to show you how inversions might work in monochrome. And one place where the rubber really meets the road is using LAB adjustments and a variety of Photoshop blending modes. So we're going to get to that topic also. I showed this diagram last week. It's a color space diagram. The gist here is that sRGB is intended for screens on the internet and is a small, low gamut RGB color space. Gamut means width of color. Adobe RGB is bigger than sRGB. ProPhoto RGB is bigger than Adobe RGB. CMYK is about the same size as a mid-range gamut RGB space, but does not entirely overlap. LAB is bigger than both and has colors that are called imaginary colors because they can only be described and not seen by human vision. The takeaway here is that you should make sure you are importing your raw files into Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw Photoshop as in ProPhoto RGB and as wide a gamut as possible, because once you lose colors, you don't easily get them back. Inside Photoshop, you've got a lightness channel, an A channel, and a B channel. There are two really interesting properties about this. One is that the black and white information is separate from the color information. So you can operate either on the color channel or channels or on the grayscale channel or channels, but you don't have to do both at the same time. This is a unique property of the way the LAB color space has been architected. The other interesting property here is that the color channels are color opponent. So the L channel includes white and black and is neutral in the middle. The A channel goes from green to magenta and is neutral in the middle. and the B channel goes from yellow to blue and is neutral in the middle. This color opponent property lends itself very nicely to a couple of different manipulations. Here are some of the channel inversions you can get, starting with the Bougainvillea bract shown on the upper left of this kind of Andy Warhol-like illustration. Lab channel equalizations. Equalizations are really cool things. And I showed last time how to download, install, and use my color action. Okay, so we're going to get to questions and this slide at the end. Right now, let's go and do a bit of work here. So as I'm getting started, Phyllis, are there any questions yet?
So far, no questions.
Okay, good. Everybody knows everything then.
Absolutely.
Perfect. So let's see, what are we going to open this with? Okay, Photoshop is a good thing to open it with. Here's where this image of Kirsten, the model's name was Kirsten, ended up. It was photographed in a dark room with a single, maybe 5-foot-high softbox light off to the side. You can see the a reflection of the light in her eyes. Let me show you what the raw file looks like. There's the raw file. And you can see that it came a long way before it was finished. Okay, so yes, there was a fair amount of work here. Now let's see. Okay. So I've reduced this in size for ease of I'm having some, okay, shut that down. Let's see. Okay. I've reduced this in size for ease of speed of doing this.
Harold Inger has a question.
Go ahead, Inger.
Are there specific colors, parts in the color spectrum, wavelengths, that are expanded to colors that humans cannot see, like in the shorter blue part or in the red part?
I think so, but again, that's a question for a physicist, really, rather than than me. It's a great question. I would suspect that you would find things in the cyan and at the ends of the channels, the cyan, magenta, green, and yellow ends that are most like that.
And also, John Wensley would like to know what Pink Floyd album has inspired your best work?
Well, that's a good question. How about The Dark Side of the Moon? Okay, so I'm going to put this into LAB color. I'm going to make a duplicate. And what I'd like to do to this portrait here is I'd like to make her lips just a little more red, and I'd like to add some yellow to the hair. Now I know I can do the yellow with the B channel in LAB, and also let's make her eyes a little more blue, and also let's sharpen the pupils of her eyes. Those things are something that you want to do with portraits a fair amount of time. However, you don't want it to be obvious. Okay, so that says don't overdo it. So looking at the channels here, If I want to make her lips redder, I will take the A channel, and I can go Image, Adjustment, Equalize, and you can see that gives a really preposterous amount of redness and a kind of grotesque look here, but don't worry about how it looks. I select all the channels and I drag it back over like that. I'm going to put a hide all layer mask on top. I'm going to make my A channel thing disappear for a minute, and I'm going to go magnify the lips. Okay, so now the deal would be to take a low opacity brush and paint in the areas. I would suggest here no more than 20% certainly, but you want a low opacity. Well, I'm going to up it a little bit more so they can actually see what's happening. Okay, so taking a look at the layers, we can call this one lips. And there's with the lab adjustment on, here's with it off. Okay, now let's go back to our thing here, our duplicate. We'll take off the equalization of the A channel. We'll go to our channels palette, and I'm intentionally showing this manually, not via the use of my action at this point, because it is important to understand what's going on under the hood, even though there's automation available. So I do Image, Adjustment, Equalize again. And what this adjustment did is, as you can see, took the blues and made them bluer, and took the yellows and made them yellower. This is, you know, she's a lovely woman, of course, even without enhancements, but there's nothing that virtual can't make better if you don't overdo it too much. Oops, I just made a mistake there, because what I did, and it's a good mistake to see, before you drag it over, you have to make sure that all channels are selected, otherwise you get a black and white mask on top. And there we go, I just made another goof. There we go. Incidentally, one thing you could play with here is putting it into a different blending mode. It'll look a little different in color like that, which performs a little differently than normal. So we're going to do two things here. We're going to put a layer mask on top, hide all, and I'm going to paint in the hair, her hair. I recommend a bigger, fatter brush for that. Yeah, let's see, we may need a little bit more opacity on the brush. Okay, that's pretty nice. See, everyone see the difference? And we're going to go to her eyes, like that. We're going to take a small brush, and, well, much smaller than that. And, okay, so I just painted in her eyes in an exaggerated way. It's a contact lens, right? A colored contact lens. So I'm going to go a little lower than that, because she has beautiful eyes, and why overdo it with that? There you go. So let's back out for a second here. So you can see the adjustments that I made were so here you go. I add red lips, and then I add blue eyes and yellow hair. At this point, I would archive the image. I would save it in its layered state, but I'm not going to take up any time in the webinar doing that. Instead, I'll just flatten the image and let's sharpen her eyes a bit. So to do that, you want layer, duplicate layer. Let's come in on the eyes. And we want to make sure that we have just the L channel selected, but all channels visible. And now we go to the good old-fashioned Unsharp Mask. And okay, so maybe about like that. This is a little bit more exaggerated than you would ever want to do it, and it's careful. It's important to keep it just to the area that you want to sharpen for selective sharpening. So I'm going to paint it in at about 20% like that. And I'll go like that. If you wanted to improve her mascara here, you give her some virtual makeup too. So backing out. It's funny how these things that are little adjustments can make a big issue on a finished portrait. You know, there's no substitute for getting the stuff right in camera, or if you're going to be working with models, having a good makeup artist do this. But, you know, it's really not bad as part of one's quiver of how to do portraitures of people, is to know that you can do this kind of thing in post-production as well as right up front. Before I move on to a landscape example, are there any questions about what I did to Kirsten here?
Michael has a question. When you started, you duplicated the image instead of creating new layers. Why did you do that?
Good question, Michael. So look, one of the things about Photoshop is there are always multiple ways to do everything. And sometimes it doesn't make that much difference which one you choose. The reason that I sometimes prefer to duplicate an image and have the original and the duplicate side by side rather than having a duplicate layer that I operate on is that way I can more easily compare what I've done with the original. And when I see that I like it, then I can pull it on top and make it a layer. If it's a layer to see what's underneath it, I'm going to have to turn it on and off, and it's much harder to do a visual A/B comparison that way. But ultimately, the two workflows will arrive at the same place, of course. Thanks, Michael.
And Yukiko would like to know, before you leave lab, do you save and flatten?
Absolutely. That's a great question. You should not go between color spaces with a layered document. So you should archive the copy with layers, save it, flatten it, and then move back to RGB. Good question, Yukiko.
So when you say archive, you mean you actually save that version of the image in lab with the layers.
Yes.
And then you flatten, and then you
Yes.
move on to the new version.
Yes, exactly.
And
okay,
Dave,
go ahead.
One more. David would like to know, are there any instructions on what adjustments to make or create with effects rather than to try everything to see? I don't quite...
Well, yeah, I'm not sure I get the gist of that question.
I don't quite understand the question.
I mean, if it seems like I'm flailing around at random here, I'm not. You know, these are very targeted adjustments in the sense that I know her lips are red. Therefore, if I want to increase the red, I know I have to operate on the B channel. If I want to increase something in a channel, I know that I have to use the equalize adjustment. So, you know, these are targeted kinds of retouching, unlike the way my macro operates, my action operates, which is kind of a scatter shot. Here's a palette, do what you want with it. In the next one, I'll show doing that and showing how you can select from the palette, which is a little bit more like what David is saying, a sort of random process where you choose what you want to do. On purpose here, I took the little bit more labor of actually showing the adjustments so you can see what's under the hood.
I think also it's an aesthetic choice. You know, you look at a portrait or you look at a landscape and you say, I want to make this different, or I want to enhance this. And then you say, okay, how do I get there? And then you use that method to get there. So that's really, you know, for a portrait, sharpening the eyes is most excellent.
Sharpening the eyes, if you don't overdo it, is going to take place on almost every portrait. And will help. I mean, sometimes, you know, you don't have the time and you don't want to bother. And, you know, if I'm photographing high school seniors, and by the way, the last time I commercially photographed school kids was more years ago than I care to say. It was one of my first professional jobs as a photographer was to do school photography a long time ago.
Oh,
But
and Kelly has a question.
Go ahead, Kelly.
It seems like these adjustments could also have been done in RGB. Why is Lab better?
Could you ask Kelly how she would do them in RGB?
Well, I would say that Lab is better because the black and white channel is separated out.
Right. I mean, what I'm saying, I was being a little, I wasn't being totally clear in my glib response. I don't think they can easily be done in RGB. Certainly not with the 2 or 3 strokes that I used here. I mean, certainly you can do anything you want. I mean, there are always many ways to do anything in Photoshop, which I think I said a few comments ago. And certainly you can do lots of nice adjustments in RGB, and I'd be happy to actually show some of those too, and then mask them and mask in what you want. But I don't know any direct way to get at the color information and move it so quickly as an LAB. And as Phyllis said, this is just the color information. So we're taking advantage of 2 parts of how LAB is constructed here to do this. One, where we're just operating on the color information. And in fact, specifically, we're operating on a color channel. So we can just move on the red information. It's relatively hard to do that without also involving the black and white information and other color information in RGB. We're also taking advantage of the color opponent aspect of it, because what the equalize adjustment does is it takes whatever you have and brings it to the max. So it'll take the red in the channel to the max, or the blue in the channel, or the yellow in the channel. So this is, I really don't know any other way to do this so easily.
Right. I think also, you know, a real difference with Lab is that, you know, you do have that black and white channel, which is lightness and darkness, and that is completely separate from the colors. Whereas in RGB, that darkness and lightness is blended into each color. So you can't really separate that out. And that makes things so much more difficult in RGB.
Here's a finished image, widely reproduced, photographed as a blend of a bunch of different raw files from Lambert Dome, which is on the eastern side of Tuolumne Meadow in the High Sierra, and at sunset. Beautiful place to be at sunset. Let me just quick run through some of the raw files that I shot. This is a 1/60th of a second. 1/320th of a second, 1/800th of a second, 1/400th of a second, 1/200th, another 200th shot. Okay, so here's a blend of the existing images. Okay, so not bad compared to the final. I'm much of the way there, but let's take this. Let's put it into LAB. And again, I knocked this down in size. I put it down from 300 to 72 ppi, and to make it so it isn't going to be so time consuming to deal with. Put it in LAB color. I'll make myself a nice duplicate here. Image, duplicate. I'll make the duplicate a bit smaller so the files that come out of this thing are manageable. And now I'm going to run my LAB action on this. Okay, so let's see what palette we have over here. Here's an AB equalization. Here's a B equalization. Here's an A equalization, L equalization, various inversions, okay? I can tell you right off the bat that with a landscape, unless you're aiming for something basically surreal and weird, like the background of my virtual screen background, you don't really want the inversions. Okay, the channel inversions aren't going to be all that helpful unless you want a sort of negative effect for color reasons. So I'm going to shut the inversions here. I'm not going to save anything. And let's see. Okay, so just like with a portrait, you almost always want a you almost always want to sharpen the eyes slightly. With a landscape, you almost always want to increase the dynamic range slightly. So one formula for doing that is to take the L channel equalization and put it into soft light blending mode at 10% over the original landscape. This will always enhance the dynamic range slightly, and it's almost always worth doing with a landscape image. Okay, so this is an L equalization. Oddly, or perhaps not oddly, when you work in LAB color, the 3-channel equalization is the same as the L channel equalization, because all you're changing is the black and white information, and and the doing it in the grayscale is the same thing as doing it overall. So I recommend not doing this higher than about 12%. It's 10 to 12% is the right range. You want this just to be at the very edge of perception, the edge of the doors of perception, as Aldous Huxley might have said. Okay, so I'm going to do 2 other things to this image. I'm going to amplify the orange and blue in the sky slightly. So let's do that using the, actually I want my A channel equalization. What happened to my A channel equalization? I think I might have shut it. Oh gosh, I can't have done that. Well, okay, let's go back and re-get it then. We can do this. So I'm going to go A, select everything, image, adjustment, equalize. Yeah, that's more like it. Okay, so now I'm going to go copy this over. What I like to do when I do this is keep a copy of my image in place so that I can see what I'm painting over. If I want, I can put this into color blending mode. which amps the colors just a little bit. So I'm going to put a layer mask over the top, layer, hide all. And I'm going to get a nice big floppy brush, like about, oh, it's way too big, about like that. And I'm going to paint it in at about 20%. That's probably going to be too much, but I want to show you what I'm doing. Okay, and then down on the trees, let's get a little bit of this nice color stuff on the trees. Too. Okay, do that. And there you go. Let's go to the B equalization. No, not you, I don't want you. Let's go to the nice B equalization. Now the B equalization is going to be really good for both the trees and the forest landscape stretching out across the Sierra. By the way, if you ever get to travel through Yosemite again, the top of this dome, Lambert Dome, is a real good place to visit. So this was an A equalization. It's only about a 2-mile walk up to the top and on a nice trail up the backside. This is a B. Q. I'm going to put it in color blending mode. Layer, layer mask, hide all. Let's get a little more blue in that sky. Okay, just like so. Maybe over here too. And let's paint some nice sunset colors in here. Maybe on the rock a little more saturation here. And there you have it. So this is pretty much the way the final image was presented and turned out. I might do a few things more, like to this area. I might want to, here, let me show you what I would do to this area. But before I move on, any questions about this?
We had a question about where people can get a copy of your action, and I put the link up in the chat. And also after the webinar, I'll get everyone's emails from the attendee list, and I'll be sending out a whole list of links and things that are mentioned today.
Yeah, on my website is the short answer, and there's a README file that you can either read or download with installation instructions. It's pretty straightforward. Okay. So flattening it, layer, duplicate layer, put it in screen blending mode, and put a layer mask on top. This isn't LAB stuff. This is just straight, could do this in RGB perfectly well if you preferred. Just sort of bringing out a little more detail here, painting it in here. Yeah, there you go. Okay, I can't resist. And maybe I would also maybe darken the trees a little. It's pretty typical to use a screen and blending multiple modes as sort of paired adjustments. So this one is multiply, layer mask, hide all. Let's put a little bit more of the sunset color there for the Duama. A little more here. You have to say Duama like that. Duama, there you go. All right, the clear danger with this kind of thing is that you can take an image and go over the top without even knowing you are once you're wrapped up in it. But many of my images many of my successful landscape images that are in color do have LAB enhancements as part of them, and I try to keep it into some kind of reasonable restraint. Any questions about this before I move on?
Yes, Kurt would like to know, how did the L equalization enhance the dynamic range?
Well, thank you, Kurt. There are two ways I can begin to answer this. wrapping one's brain around the color theory of LAB is a kind of exercise for either propeller heads or physicists or something. What the L equalization is giving you is a map from lights to darks, and when you put that over in the soft light blending mode, when you create a layer stack and use it, what that is doing is it's enhancing the lights and enhancing the dark. So if you think about it, what that does is it pulls apart the dynamic range. Overlay blending mode, by the way, does much the same thing, but in a somewhat harsher way. So it's worth experimenting with overlay blending mode as well as soft light if you want to do that. I find soft light at about 10% is completely benign. It's not going to do it in an obnoxious way. Let me go back for a second and see, let's see where we, I think I still have this in the history palette. We can see. I should have saved this, right, Phyllis?
Right.
Here that's why I always archive this stuff. Here we are, just before I flattened the image and moved on. Here, I just pulled the L equalization in soft light blending mode layered at the top. So, you know, this is one of those things that may not come over via a webinar to your computer screen from my computer screen all that well, but it's a significant difference that I can see, and particularly if you look at, say, the area around something like these trees down here. There.
If you take up your opacity on the layer for just a little bit, you'll really be able to see it better, I think.
I think you're right.
It's a pretty subtle adjustment there.
Okay, so let's go back out for a second. Yeah, so here we are at 72%. Now, this is a nice way to ruin an image. That should be the title of the webinar, How to Ruin an Image. But you can certainly see that in fact it is increasing the dynamic range of the image. What you want to do is you want to put it down here. And again, this is relying on the LAB property that the black and white information is separate from the color information. Okay? Who asked that question? Was it Kurt?
That was Kurt.
Kurt, are you happy with my explanation?
We'll see in a minute.
Okay.
And
I mean, some of this is basically math behind it, because the color calculations inside LAB are mathematical in nature, and to really answer the question in a way that would satisfy the mathematical part of me, I'd have to go to the formulas for pixel mixing, which is probably not something we really want to do right now.
Kurt says yes, and Carolyn asks, do you risk taking the colors out of Gamut for printing?
Absolutely. Great question, whoever asked that. That was Carol?
That was Carolyn.
Carolyn. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Big potential issue. We really used to see this back when I first started using LAB, you know, maybe 15 years ago. And some of my images were simply unprintable, which was sad. Very sad, right, Phyllis?
Right. Well, it depends if you're going to an RGB printing space like we do with our Epson printer, or if for our books, we have to, I have to profile every single one of Harold's images into the CMYK profile for the printing press, whichever printing press the publisher decides to use. They send me an ICC profile for that press, and then I have to profile each image for that press. And usually there's not huge shifts at this point, but once in a while there'll be one that maybe Harold worked on that's kind of got more bright, huge colors or huge greens and blues. And you hit it with that CMYK profile and bam, it sucks the color right out of it. And then we have to make adjustments. We've kind of learned over the years that sometimes you even have to think of, okay, you've got two images here. We have the RGB version, we have the CMYK version.
And so, the LAB version.
And the LAB version, exactly. So
So absolutely, Carol, it's a good question and a great consideration. I mean, I'd say you first of all, it's got easier. Okay, in the 15 years since I started doing this, far fewer of my images have any real serious printing problems in either color space. And I don't think that's because I've got so much better at it. I think it's because the technology, both cameras and printing, has got better, uh, which is good. May it continue to get better. Uh, but what you have to do is you have to be disciplined about it, and being disciplined about it means you need to work on a profiled monitor, do a good soft proof to see what it looks like, and watch very carefully for color shifts when you shift into a different color space. Okay, so if you're going to be printing out of RGB to a printer, you know, in your studio or in your house, when you make that shift from LAB back to RGB, watch it bloody carefully, and watch it when it comes down, by the way, also to a color space for JPEG. And if there is a change, there are things you can do to get it back. Okay, so maybe let's say that I lose some of that red in the sky here when I've shifted down to RGB. It could happen, right, Phyllis?
Absolutely.
So one thing I can do about that is I can exaggerate it. I can make a version specifically for printing, not for the screen, where I exaggerate the color before I take it across color spaces. I like that question a lot because it's a real life issue that does happen when you're working in such a wide gamut color space.
And Thelma has the question, is this covered in detail in one of your digital darkroom books?
Well, it depends what you mean by detail, Thelma. The the first Photoshop darkroom book is my book to date, which has the most un-LAB color. So that's where I'd recommend you go. But in detail, I would need to write a full book on it, and I have not done that yet.
All right, I think that's it for now.
All right, let's go to another example. I'm going to close all here. Apply to all and don't save them. Ah! Okay, so let's see. I have a broken arrow somewhere. Oh, there's my broken arrow. I think I might have, let me see if no, not there, not there. Ah, the arrow conundrum, the reduced version. That's what I wanted. Okay. This is an image that I've used fairly often when I do an in-person LAB workshop because it's basically a simple image. It's pretty close to monochromatic, and it's something that can be used to create intricate colors and patterns in LAB pretty quickly, which is kind of bizarre. Notice that I've reduced this and taken down the bit depth to 8 bits. It's a photograph of a pedestrian directional arrow on the walkway to the Bay Bridge from the East Bay of San Francisco over to Treasure Island, with the shadows of the railing over the white arrow and over the pavement of the sidewalk. Okay, so image, mode, LAB color. Run the action. Okay, let's see what we got here. So let's make this big puppy, big boy smaller. Let's make my arrow bad boy smaller. Okay, so here's an A-B equalization. Here's a B equalization. You're beginning to see that I have a pretty big palette here, right? A equalization, L equalization. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick one of these. I'm going to flip it and run the macro again. Can I have some shout outs, please, about which version I should pick? Phyllis, can you give me a shout out or two? Just one is fine.
Okay, I think people are typing. Gigi says upper left.
Does she mean the LAB inversion? If so, we'll pick it.
Why don't you wiggle it around there?
Okay.
Yep, the LAB inversion. Oh, Kelly also says B equalization. David says maize and blue.
I think Gigi got here first. We'll do the LAB inversion. We'll come back on others. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go image rotation, and I'm going to flip it horizontally. So now my arrow is facing the other way. Okay, and I'm going to run the macro on it again. I keep saying macro. Actually, Photoshop actions are macros, but please understand, I mean LAB action, the one I wrote by it. Okay, here we go. We're running it again. Oh, this is fun. So everyone can see perhaps that we've got a mess of files here. Let's take one of them into back into RGB. And let me tell you why I'm taking it back into RGB. Let's see, I'm going to take the L inversion. So what we have now is we did an LAB inversion of the, just to recap here, it's going to get crazy in a minute. We did an LAB inversion of the original arrow. We flipped it horizontally, and then we took its L inversion. And the reason I take the L inversion back into RGB is that not all my Photoshop blending modes are available in Lab. So here I go. Image, mode, RGB. So this L inversion, I'm going to make it a little bigger than the other so we can see which one we're working on. Okay, and now I'm going to take one of the arrows going. Here, let's get some of these minimized. I wanted arrow going counter this arrow, so let me find it. An arrow going counter this arrow, and okay. Okay.
Yeah, Harold, I think when you ran your action, for some reason, it didn't work on the flipped one. It worked on one of the ones pointing to the left, not to the right.
I think you're right, but I think it doesn't matter too much. I think this LAB inversion will do fine. So I'm pulling it over, and what I do is I range through the blending modes here, and all of a sudden we have this carpet indifference. Okay, I'm going to put it into subtract blending mode. This is one of the ones that's not available in LAB. Let's go to this AB equalization here. Let me flip it, image rotation, flip it vertically, okay? And let me run the macro on it, the action on it again. Yeah, it's not so dramatic in terms of the color shifts here because we already have a pretty homogeneous color set. So I'm going to take this back over the stack we have here, and okay, now let me close that. Let me just get rid of some of these other things so that we aren't going totally crazy here.
Gigi says she's lost in a sea of arrows.
I tell her, you and me both, Gigi. Give me a sec to make some of these disappear. One reason for using the arrow as a sort of demo of this is it is such an iconic shape and it's easy to keep track of. And so you can kind of see I'm going to keep this one out because it's kind of cool. You can see the breadth of what goes on here with the colors. And one of the things that I've had feedback, and I find myself that can be very confusing about all this, is where do you stop, number one? And number two, if you have 12 versions you like out of one original image, where do you say, how do you present them? So one thing I've done is I've presented sequence of these images, and I've also made Andy Warhol-like collages with them. So both things are possible. So let's cycle through. It should be noted, by the way, I didn't say this explicitly, but it's worth saying that when you copy an image over, you are changing it to the color space of the underlying file. So it automatically converts when you do that. So here we go, background, this, and here's another one. What blending mode should I put this in? Well, let's see, here's what screen would look like. That's kind of cool. Multiply is a standard stop. It's too dark in this case. Screen is kind of interesting. A darker color is an interesting one. Overlay is interesting. Dark, soft light. Hard pin light can be interesting. Hard mix, not bad. So really, as difference, exclusion, really what you're limited by as you do this is your imagination. There's no limit to how far you can go with these various processes. Here's divide. Every time I do it, I end up with something different. Let me throw this particular one, which I liked, on top. Okay, and let's see, let's try it with difference. That's not bad, that's pretty different. You don't have to keep the opacity at 100% either. In fact, you could even go further than that. You can put a hide all layer mask on top, layer mask, hide all, and then use the gradient tool to partly paint in, so you have two very different things from top and bottom. So let's do that for this second. Then to take this one step further, what I'm going to do is I'm going to layer it down, move it into LAB color, and run the macro again on it. Well, we're going to have something silly going on here because I'm obviously not running the macro on the right thing. Save, don't save. I don't think it's the right thing. It couldn't be.
And Harold Yukiko has a question.
Hi, Yukiko.
You put the files on top before going back to RGB?
Yes, so what's happening when I'm doing that is I'm automatically converting it to RGB. the underlying image there was in RGB. So when I pull a LAB across, it becomes RGB. It automatically converts. The underlying, in a layer stack, when you pull a new layer over an item in the layer stack, it assumes the color space of the underlying layer. Is that Phyllis, did I express myself clearly there?
I do believe so.
Okay.
And Inger wants to know, does the macro work better in Photoshop CC 2017 than CC 2020?
It shouldn't make any difference. As far as I know, it works on all known versions of Photoshop. In fact, going back a long way, the reason I'm not using the most advanced version of Photoshop is my presentation laptop is an old piece of hardware dating, in fact, to 2013. Okay, so let's try this again. Let me make it a little smaller. I like to do Photoshop stuff that doesn't require the latest and greatest. And I think that's part of Phyllis and my Photoshop philosophy, is to try to use the primitives of Photoshop rather than have to have something that's always the newest thing. Let me make this a duplicate. That sound reasonable to you, Phyllis?
Absolutely. I'd rather have everybody have access to something than not be able to do something because they don't have the latest and greatest.
All right, that's more like it. Although I'm starting to see, there you go, that's pretty cool. So let's go back to this one. Let's put it back into RGB. Let's make it bigger. Let's pull this version of it, the LAB inversion of the thing, over it. Oops. Oops. All right, come on, you can do this. Okay, let's find a nice blending mode here. Oh, no, difference takes away some of the pack. Nope. Oh, divide is kind of cool. Oh, I'm going to go with, yeah, I don't know, hold on. Oh, I like color, that's kind of cool. And then let's do a layer mask, hide all, and let's do a left to right gradient on this thing. Okay. I actually think this is becoming a pretty cool abstraction here. We could make a tablecloth out of it, right? Okay, I want to throw this open for questions at this point.
Joe says, I'm new and use 2020, and the paths are different between the years. For the user like me, how do I keep up?
I'm not sure I understand the question, Joe.
Maybe she means with all the upgrades, how do you keep up?
I don't know, send that one to Adobe.
Really?
I've got tired of it myself, and basically I just try to keep my systems working. I don't try to have the latest and greatest necessarily.
And I have to say, I'm kind of an old Luddite here. I have a really old Mac that I love, and that's my production machine. So I have to say that my favorite Photoshop, I'm a dinosaur. My favorite Photoshop for the print engine, the color engine, and everything is CS2. So it's way long ago, but it works great for me, and it doesn't have all the automation in it. They're always trying to, throw in special guides that are going to help you, and it's like, stop! I want to do it myself.
Well, a couple of comments on that. I mean, one is that auto sampling techniques can work pretty well and be real time savers. But Phyllis is not alone in saying that the color engine was best in CS2. There's a whole internet subculture devoted to that and that belief. I'd like to try to understand Joe's question a little better, so maybe I can help him instead of being facetious about it. Can you let Phyllis know what problem you're having? I mean, it's great to run the latest and greatest. Why not?
Gigi has a suggestion. Maybe she means the screens look different, and she wonders where to find the actions, etc.
Oh, okay. Thanks for that, Gigi. So the actions are on the actions panel that you get to by window actions. So if you go window actions, that'll come up. The way the screen looks is something you can configure in preferences. So Photoshop, preferences, workspace, generally, for some reason, it isn't coming up on my installation right now, but that's where you set the color background, and I do have it as a pretty old-fashioned setup here.
Right, and I think it's important to note that you don't work with tabs. You're using individual windows, and the newer versions of Photoshop do have this tab paradigm, and I think using individual windows is much easier.
In preferences, there's a checkbox that says bring up tabs by default, and if you uncheck, I see the problem. My preferences window went over there. So this checkbox, as it happens right here, open documents as tabs. If you uncheck that, you don't get tabs. So that makes things look a lot different. Interface over here, the default color scheme is to use this black one. And that's what would probably look more recognizable to Joe with the 2020 version, but you can set it to be like mine by setting the color there. And these are all matters of choice. There's no right and no wrong about it.
I think that's answered the question.
Good. Okay, anything else here? Otherwise, I'm going to pretty much call it a wrap, Phyllis. I think this is complicated. I'd like to see what people come up with. I think it's a wonderful technology and a real trippy enhancement to creativity of all sorts. I mean, look what we started with here. We started with a silly arrow, right? Silly arrow image, and very quickly moved to something like this. Again, if you look at the image behind me on the screen, and I'm going to stop sharing for a second. If you look at the image behind me on the screen, I built up this image back here in very much the same way. There's no barriers beyond one's imagination to what you can do with this. And I'm looking forward to seeing some great results from everybody over time. Thank you very much.
And Inger has a question. Can you define a particular color in lab?
Well, a physicist can.
I think you can, like in the color picker in lab, you can get the window open and just set the values and come up with a specific color.
Absolutely. Yeah. And a physicist certainly can. I'm more used to using something like a color wheel or a description of a color myself, so I'm not sure. But basically, when you think of LAB, it's specified by a triplet, by 3 numbers, which would be separated by commas. And if you do that, that uniquely defines a color, just as 3 numbers define an RGB value and 4 numbers define a CMYK value.
Right. And Carrie says, Harold, please, pretty please, write that book on lab with a big smiley face.
I do want to.
Ron says, thanks, Harold and Phyllis. A bit like drinking from a fire hose, but it will sink in on review of the posted video.
I agree. I find when I get too much in this, it's like I come back out to the real world and it's like, oh.
Feel a little startled.
Yes. Hey, thank you, everybody, very, very much.
you enjoyed this video and found it informative. Be creative and stay mighty.